I did put last week's video on YouTube. I was trying to figure out the best avenue through which to get these videos to you in case you're gone for a week and you have to miss. I know when I'm in a series and I'm listening to a series and I have to miss one, I feel like I've missed part of the lesson and I don't know where I am. Kind of like starting a movie halfway in it. You don't know who the people are, what the plot is. So let me know if that, if you do want to watch those videos, if that avenue is not a good one for you, then we can try to figure out something else. But I think that's probably the best way for the video to get it to you. Videos are so big in content, in size, that they're not emailable. So I've got to post them somewhere for you to access.
Yeah, that was good. I liked it.
Did you?
Yeah, so I appreciate it.
Oh, good deal. Well, we'll keep it up, and if there's another way, I know Myrna needs some notes. I'm going to try to type up some notes so that for the people who don't have access to the video, they can at least get the notes and see where we've been. Because you really don't want the notes that I'm reading here. They're gobbledygook. And oftentimes I get mixed up just reading them, so I may say something wrong just because I'm having a hard time reading my own notes. But welcome back. And again, this is a study on Matthew, but we're not there yet. We're still in the Old Testament, but we're about to leave the Old Testament. Today we will leave the Old Testament behind, but we won't start Matthew yet.
We'll be wandering for 400 years.
We'll be wandering for 400 years. It could be a long series. Now, I want to start off today in the book of Daniel. Daniel is a particularly interesting book in the Old Testament. In this book, both Daniel and the King Nebuchadnezzar, get some visions from God about the future. And they lay out not necessarily exact dates and timelines, but scenarios that will happen in the future. And now that all of those things have happened, it's easy for us to go back and read those and fit things together. So we're going to start out in the book of Daniel to read a little bit about what's going to happen during these 400 years that the Bible is silent. When you get to the end of the Old Testament, you're actually at a period of time that's about 400 years before the New Testament even starts. And so what we read in Daniel is going to, in some way, fill that gap for us. We will also talk about some other books that are out there that are not what we call non-canonical. We'll talk about a canon as well. But other books that are out there that give us some reference to what was going on at that time. And that'll help us get ready for what we read in Matthew as well. But just to recap, just really quickly, we started out with King Saul. And so for 3 kings, we had a united kingdom, and then the kingdom was divided. You had Rehoboam on the south and Jeroboam on the north, the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, north and south. And then what nation conquered the north? Assyria. And the north became part of the Assyrian Empire. The south stayed independent for a while longer. And remember, King Hezekiah prayed to God. And God protected them, sent that angel. But in about 605, Assyria got conquered by Babylon. And Babylon came all through that area, and they went all the way down to Egypt, and they conquered Egypt. And then Jerusalem and the area of Judah is caught in between. And so, in essence, Judah fell, although they were not conquered per se, but they fell to the control of Babylon, and they started paying tribute to Babylon in 605. And then we see some rebellions happen, and we didn't go into detail on those rebellions, but we see some things happen, and eventually Babylon does conquer Jerusalem and Judea because of some resistance that they experienced. So we see that a bunch of people were deported in 597, 596 BC. We also see that Jerusalem absolutely fell to Babylon in 587, 586 BC. And the temple fell at that time. And the people, the general population was deported to Babylon, and some of them were also scattered to other parts of the world at that time. When that happened, what happened to religious experience? We talked about it a little bit last week. It changed a bit because they no longer had a temple. So they couldn't really uphold the Mosaic law in the same way. All of the religious festivals that happened in Jerusalem, all of the sacrifices that had to happen at the temple, none of that could happen anymore in the same way. And the people became, what did we call it last week? A people of the book. Okay? There was a lot more emphasis on just the study and scholarship of the law. And so their religious experience ended up being a lot more about getting together in a, what we would call a church-like experience, getting together and talking about the law, dialoguing about what the law meant in our new lives, in our new experience in Babylon, and trying to figure out what does God expect in this new world that we're living in. And then we talked about last week the 70 years and what that 70 years might have been about. We talked about God preserving His land. Remember the Sabbath years. We talked about the Sabbath years that were expected in the law of Moses, and how the people may have not kept those Sabbath years. And so being deported out of the land into Babylon allowed the land, the actual land of Judea and Israel, to get the rest, the Sabbath rest that was designed by God in the first place. And we read about that in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And then in Chronicles it talks about the land finally had its rest. While they're over there is when we see the books of Daniel. We also see other books Ezekiel wrote at that time. And so we're going to talk about Daniel, Daniel was taken at this very, very, very first date that we see that Babylon came in. And what happened, although Judea was not conquered, because they then paid tribute to Babylon, Babylon took with them some of the key people, some of the young boys, back to Babylon to serve as translators or to serve as culture, I don't know, how would I describe it? People who could convey the culture to other people. They needed to learn the culture of the Babylonians. The Babylonians needed to learn the culture of the Jews. And these individuals that were brought over at that very first time were people who could influence one way or the other the cultural experience. And so we had these young men taken, and Daniel was one of those young men. Who were some of the other young men that we read about? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's right. Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I am a Statler Brothers fan. I know I'm a little young, but I love Statler Brothers. And I love their song about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's one of my favorites. Okay, so let's go to the book of Daniel. Daniel he has grown up, per se. I mean, he's been in Babylon. He stays in Babylon his entire life. That full 70 years. He probably is about, I'm going to guess, 12 years old when he's taken. That is about the time where a Jewish boy steps into manhood. Give or take. But it's also a time when you can really persuade and affect a person with cultural experience. So I'm going to say 12 years old. Now, we read at the end of Daniel where he's been in the land for 70 years. So by the end of the book of Daniel, he's probably, if he's 12 when he goes, he's probably about 80 years old when he's writing at the end of his book, Daniel, the book that's written about him, or however much he wrote, and then other people might have finished it off at the tail end. So, he is in Babylon for the duration of his life. While he's there, he grows up near the king. Remember, he was taken so that they could translate. If you have legal documents from a governor in Judea all the way, or the king in Judea at the time, all the way to Babylon, you're going to translate those legal documents to the royal court. Maybe not directly to the king, but definitely to the royal court somehow, somewhere. And so his experience in Babylon was very near the king. In fact, we read in the book of Daniel how the king brought his own food, the king's food, to the table of these young Jews. And Daniel and his friends say, no, no, we're going to respect the diet that God put us on. And that the things that are on your table are not legal for us to eat, so if you don't mind, we'll continue with our diet. And of course, the guy who brought the food was a little scared because he was under command of the king to feed these guys. And Daniel said, well, just give us a little bit and see if we're okay. And so they kind of do this pilot test on their own food, and it works out. But so he's very near the king. He's very near the experience of the palace. And he grows up in a fairly legitimate position that is near the king's ships, and multiple kingships, or the rulers of the Babylonian experience. And we see a few of them in his book. But the first one that we read about is King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the one who was king at the time when all of this started. And Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And he was a fairly smart fella. He was, I'm going to say, a skeptic. Because he had around him all of these wise people, people that were wise men. And supposedly men who could interpret dreams. But what he wanted, he had a dream, and he said, I'll tell you what, you tell me what I dreamed, and then interpret it. And they're like, well, we can't do that. We can't do that. And so what he said was, put them to death. They're not wise people. They're not speaking from God. They're not people who can interpret. So he was a skeptic, and he was kind of wise. He was wanting to figure out, are these people who they say they are? Now, Daniel heard of this. Daniel said, no, don't put them to death. Bring me to the king. And that's where we pick up in the book of Daniel. I'm going to start in Daniel chapter 2. And you're welcome to read along if you want, but I'll read it here. Daniel chapter 2, and I'm going to start in verse 26. And I'm reading out of the NIV today. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, I've heard that pronounced many different ways, Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? And Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. So he flat out says that cannot be done from the human experience. However, he says, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Ooh, that's exactly what we're looking for. What's going to happen in days to come? Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind are, as you were laying in bed, are these. So here's where he's going to lay out what the dream was. Now, if someone came to you the next morning after you had a bizarre dream and said, you know what you dreamed last night? And then they laid out your dream for you without you having told them, what would you think? This person has some sort of divine intervention. Okay, this is the real deal. Okay, so here's what he says. As your majesty was laying there, your mind turned to, oh, I already read that part, sorry. Verse 31. Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver. Its belly and thighs were made of bronze, and its legs of iron. Its feet, partly of iron and partly of baked clay. Now while you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not with human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. And now, okay, he told him the dream, and now we'll interpret it for you. Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar, take note. Your power did not come from you. Your power came from the King of glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them. You are that head of gold. Remember, the statue had 4 different kinds of material. The head was gold. Babylon, you, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise inferior to yours. Okay, so it's not as big a kingdom at the present. I'm going to say that. I'm going to put that little caveat there. At the present, you don't consider it a very big kingdom. But after Babylon, after your reign, it's not really his specific reign, because there were other kings that followed Nebuchadnezzar. But after Babylon, there will be another kingdom that will rise, inferior to yours. And then next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. For iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. And the toes were partly iron and partly clay. So this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united. Ooh, the people will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place into the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about what was going to happen in the future. And his dream, per the interpretation of God through Daniel, said how many nations were going to rule? 4. The first was Babylon, the head of gold. The next we will learn is Persia. And that's going to be the chest of gold. After Persia comes the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great. That's going to be the thighs. What was it? Belly and thighs of bronze. Belly and thighs of bronze. And then after the Greek Empire comes Rome. The Roman Empire is the iron. The legs of iron and the feet of iron. Rome, we know, fell internally because they couldn't be united. They fell within themselves. It wasn't that another nation conquered Rome. It was they defeated themselves. Very interesting how all of that's laid out. And it was in the time of Rome that Christ came. And that's the story of Matthew. And that's what he says here. The mountain, the rock that's cut out of the mountain, a rock that's not made with human hands, that will crush all of those and will never be defeated, that's Christ and his kingdom. So this dream is very important to fill some of that gap between this time that we're talking about, and what we read in the New Testament, the coming of Christ, and the coming of that kingdom that will never be defeated. Now that we have the outline, we get to go through that just a little bit. And we're not going to hit every detail, but we're going to hit some highlights and fill in some of the unknowns throughout that time. So, we do know that Persia was the second one. Let me make sure that I can get off the Babylonian Empire here. A couple of things that we want to talk. We talked about last week, but I want to re-emphasize. What was one of the things that really changed through the Babylonian experience? We talked about religion and the experience of God. What about language? Okay. What was the language that became popular at that time? Aramaic. And so what we see is in the New Testament times, the general populace, many of them, spoke Aramaic or Hebrew mixed with Aramaic. The word Abba, and we're all familiar with the word Abba, meaning father or daddy, is an Aramaic term. But it's an Aramaic term that Jesus uses because that's the kind of language, the general language that people understood. And they understood that context. So, a couple of really big things. The language and the religion changed while they were over there. Because they became a people of the book, scholarship became a really big deal. And we saw the rise of, remember when they went over, priests were the ones who were more or less in charge of the religious affairs. Because they moved to a people of the book, scribes, people who wrote the law or rewrote the law and studied the law, became more important. And so when we start to see scribes, we often talk about the scribes and the Pharisees, or we talk about the scribes and the scholars. These people started growing in influence at that time. Okay, so I won't bore you with my map again today. Persia was a small nation just to the south of Babylon. We know today of the Persian Gulf, right? Persia was right at the tip of the Persian Gulf. Persia was actually where Abraham came from. Ur of the Chaldees. A lot of times you'll hear Persia called the Chaldean Empire. The Chaldees. It was just south of Babylon. And they came up, Cyrus came up, King Cyrus came up and conquered Babylon. And he continued conquering. And what he did was not only took the entire Babylonian Empire all the way to Egypt, but he also spread it across the north region, all the way almost to Greece, and then almost to India. So it was a very large empire. And so one of the things that made Persia influential was King Cyrus had a philosophy that said, let the people be who the people want to be. Let them experience religion in their way, in their places. All I ask is that they pay me money. I don't want to push my culture on them. I just want them to pay me money. So one of the things that he did, not just to the Jews, but to all of the nations that Babylon had conquered, he let them go home. And so we have this, what we call the Decree of Cyrus. There is an actual cylinder that was found, archaeologically found, that has this decree where he let the nations go home. And so that's how we know that this, not only did the Bible say it, but it is now validated through archaeological science, that this is what happened. And that happened around 537 BC. That's still in our Old Testament. We're still in the Old Testament times. Okay? So what we see is the release of captives. Now, we talked about this last week. At this time, did they really feel like they were captive? Not generally. Some of them probably did. Some of them probably had a longing for their homeland. But the vast majority of them had a decent life where they were. And a great many of them stayed there. They didn't go back to Jerusalem. They didn't go back to Judea. One of the reasons was that's a hard life. You've got to rebuild everything. Well, why would I do that when I've got a life already ready-made here? So a lot of people did not return. But about 50,000, generally speaking, returned to start that new life and to rebuild the Jewish lifestyle, or shall I say, the Hebrew lifestyle. And so they returned. They were allowed to return around 537, 536 BC. Now, when they got back, how do you think people who were still in that land felt? They didn't care for it, did they? Who are you that you want to come in and take over? We kind of liked our new lifestyle. We were not independent, but we were free. We were doing things the way we do them. And here, you're going to rock our world. You're changing things again. They didn't really like it. But there were some who had been left behind that remembered the old ways. And when people started talking about rebuilding the temple, some of the people that were still in the land wanted to help. Right? Were they allowed to help? No. No. In fact, there's a fella that was up here in the Samaritan world. The Samaria, remember Samaria used to be the capital of the northern kingdom. It fell to Assyria. Assyria sent a whole bunch of new people in, and they had mixed blood. Not only mixed blood, but for years there had been mixed religion. But there were still very faithful people there. And so they see these people coming in and wanting to rebuild the temple. And so they offer to help and are told, no, we don't want your help. We don't want your help because you're not a pure Hebrew. Now, if you were one of those Samaritans, how would you feel? Yeah, you kind of feel frustrated, wouldn't you? So what we see eventually is they actually build their own temple in Samaria, in the northern kingdom. They build another temple, another place of worship. When that happened, that was like icing on the cake to the Jews. They're like, no, that's just evidence that you're ungodly. Okay. What I'm trying to build to, when we see this in Matthew, there is an extreme tension that I don't think we understand well enough. This extreme tension between Samaritans and Jews. It was big. And it had been developed for a long time. And these are just pieces of the beginning of that. Okay, so just keep that in mind. One of the things that kind of prompted that headbutting was when they wanted to help rebuild the temple and were told, no, you can't. And so they run off and they do their own thing, which just is icing on the cake. And things go downhill from there. Okay? So yes, it started back with the division of the kingdom way back when, but now we're back around and we got it all again. We're divided people again. Now what we will see is this is a localized disagreement. Because Samaria, remember my map, we have Judea down here, Samaria is here. We actually have a region called Galilee up here. Samaria is sandwiched between Judah and Galilee. The Galileans, over time, were willing to integrate back into the Jews. The Samaritans chose not to integrate back into the kingdom. And we'll see this later. But they made a direct choice not to integrate. The Galileans said, yeah, we want to become part of your kingdom again, part of the people. The Samaritans, because of the history that had already built, said, you've already dissed us more than once. We're done. So it's a localized ideal. Let's see, where else can we go? During the time of Persia, what books do we have that were written during this time? The Old Testament books. Do we have any ideas what books might have been written during this time where Persia was in control?
Esther.
The book of Esther. The book of Esther happens well after the people go back, actually. Probably 100 years after the people go back. So Esther's family was one of those that stayed behind in Babylon. Other books that happened at this time.
Ezra and Nehemiah.
Ezra and Nehemiah. In fact, Ezra and Nehemiah didn't happen until well after this time. What happened was the people that went back started to build the temple, but they experienced opposition and they experienced hardship. And so they built the foundation, or rebuilt the foundation, but they didn't really get any further. And so the temple just laid desolate for 16 years after they had returned. And there were some other prophets that came about that said, hey, what are you doing? You're God's people, but you have not rebuilt the temple. You have not rebuilt the central house of God, the one thing that you need in order to be God's people. Prophets Haggai and, it totally slipped my mind who the other one was. Zechariah? Zephaniah? One of those two. I think Zechariah. Yes, Zechariah. Prophets Haggai and Zechariah both prophesied at this time that said, stop working on your own houses, work on the house of God. And we could read in Haggai where this is really promoted. So they encouraged the people. Oh, I didn't notice that had an eraser on it. That was weird. They encouraged the people to get back to building the house of God. So after 16 years of nothing, the temple was finally rebuilt in 520 BC. And what we read is that the people were disappointed because the temple was not nearly as glorious, as magnificent as the one that they remembered Solomon had built. But at least they built a temple, right? Oh, I'm sorry. The temple was actually completed at 515. So to 515. 520 to 515 BC. Some people say 516 BC. I mean, when we're talking that long ago, it's really hard to pin down an exact year. But 520 to 515 BC, the temple was rebuilt. Now, just because they rebuilt the temple doesn't mean their lifestyle is fixed. Right? You still have influences from the people around you. And you're still trying to rebuild life from the ground up. And so they were challenged in many ways to get back into the service of God, the faithfulness of God, the lifestyle that represents God. Years later, we read about Nehemiah. Nehemiah is where? Back in Persia. Nehemiah is still in Persia. But his brothers, his family have gone home. Through the years, somewhere in all of this, his family migrated home. And his family comes back to Persia, and so Nehemiah meets up with them and says, "Hey, how are things going back home?" "Oh, life is bad. Life is not good in Jerusalem. We're experiencing pressure from outside. The wall is not built, so we don't even feel like a protected city anymore. The crops are not growing like we want them to grow. Our religious experience, well, we just don't feel like God is with us." Nehemiah gets bummed. He gets bummed hearing about his hometown. Now, Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king at that time in Persia. So Daniel was high up, remember, in the court of Babylon. Nehemiah is now fairly high up in the court of Persia. And so one day Nehemiah brings the cup to the king, and he's despondent. He's sad. And the king says, "Why are you so sad? I've never seen you like this unless you're ill. And you're not ill. Why are you sad?" And so Nehemiah tells him, "Hey, the city where my fathers are buried," I think is how he puts it. "The city where my fathers are buried is laying desolate. The people are struggling. I'm sad because of that." And the king says, "Well, what would you like me to do? Or what do you want to do?" And Nehemiah says, "Well, if it please the king," he's very cautious about this, "if it please the king, let me go rebuild it. Let me go take care of this problem." And the king says, "Well, how long will you be gone?" And Nehemiah gives him an estimate time, and he says, "Go." And gives him a lot of the tools and the decrees and whatnot to go rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, to rebuild the city itself. Remember, the temple is already built. But now we're rebuilding the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And in doing that, rebuilding the confidence of the people. Rebuilding the people themselves. And so Nehemiah, we read, becomes the governor of Jerusalem for quite some time. Let me put a date on that. 445. 445. So we see a long time has happened here. And a whole lot of nothing has happened here because of the resistance that's been experienced. And you can imagine how disappointing of an experience that would be if you were gung-ho, hey, you're sent home. The king says, go rebuild, and you go to rebuild, and you meet resistance, and really nothing happens. You live your entire life, and you really see nothing happen out of that. You can kind of get an idea of how despondent the people might be. And so Nehemiah comes in 445 BC and says, let's rebuild. And he is there for 13 years. He spends a good number of years rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. And we can actually go to Nehemiah and we can read that story. I told you we're not going to get into depth. We're just hitting some highlights. But he goes back to Jerusalem. Resistance is, they experience resistance. They end up rebuilding the wall with a sword in one hand and a rock in the other. Rebuilding it one-handed, in essence. Okay? And they get resistance, and there are messages sent back and forth to and from the king of Persia. Is this really what you asked us to do? Hey, these people are rebuilding Jerusalem. Do you realize how frustrating the Jewish people can be? Rome realized later how frustrating the Jewish people can be. It is hard to please these people. They are unruly people. So all of these messages go back and forth. Finally, we have a wall. Finally, we're starting to build the confidence of a people of God again. But one thing that we are missing is that religious experience. We have a temple, but it's been so long before we truly understand what we do with the temple. We don't know what the religious experience around that temple should be. So what do we need? Someone to come help us understand it. Who's that going to be? Daniel's dead by this point. Daniel's already dead by this point. Yeah, but that's good. Who else came? Nehemiah and Ezra. Ezra was a scholar, a scribe. Remember, we had talked about that experience and the change to be scholars of the book. He was a scribe that was living in Persia at the time, and the king sent Ezra back over to Jerusalem to teach the people about their religious experience. Okay, so you had Nehemiah as the civic governor, and you had Ezra as a religious, not priest, but religious promoter. Okay? And so we can read in the book of Ezra about how he revitalized the laws of God for the people. And he set up the priesthood again. And there were people among the priesthood who were not, they had mixed marriages, or they were not pure in their priestly duties. And so he got rid of them. He said, you can no longer be a priest again. So he set up the purity of the priesthood. All the people stood, we read this in the book of Ezra, all the people stood, maybe Nehemiah, while Ezra read the books of law. And they said, we will do this. They recommitted their life to the books of the law while Ezra was there revitalizing. Okay? Remember that thing that we talked about, that word synagogue we read in the New Testament? And how when they changed to be a people of the book, they also kind of developed these places where people got together, not only for scholarly religious learning, but also for civic learning. Synagogues, the early Babylonian experience really emphasized getting together in these ways. And the synagogues started forming. But we believe, and when I say we, I mean a good number of scholars, believe that the formalization of the synagogues happened around the time of Ezra. Some of the archaeological findings, I think the earliest stone-built synagogue in a city dates back to about 175 BC. But synagogues as a formalized experience, we believe, started happening around the time of Ezra. And so this idea of rebuilding our civic experience through the synagogues, rebuilding our religious experience through the synagogues. You still had to go to the temple for the sacrifices and for the annual feasts. But we don't want to happen to us what has just happened to us. So let's get our act together and start remembering what the law says. And so we're going to start talking about the law in these smaller groups. It takes 10 men to form a synagogue. At least that's what they say. You have to have 10 men to form a synagogue. So what you see is synagogues form in these communities. And these communities then are places of civic learning. Remember, this is a place where you learn to read, learn to write, but it's also a place where all of the people got together, and you weren't excluded from the synagogue if you were a woman. You got to come into the synagogue and listen to the laws being read. Listen to the scholars talking through the laws. This is also a time when we start seeing, because of these conversations, an idea of the oral law develop. The Jews, even today, emphasize what we call as the oral law. We have the written law, which is the first 5 books, the written law of God. But then they will say there are places where that written law doesn't quite cover every avenue of life, every area of life. And so there are articulations that are made orally that interpret how that law is to be enacted in certain ways, in certain places. And so we have the development of an oral law. Now that was eventually codified, made standardized, and when we get to the New Testament, that oral law is as important, if not sometimes more important, than the actual law itself. When we hear the words Talmud and Mishnah, the Mishnah is essentially, if I get this right, I don't want to say it wrong. The Mishnah is the written version of what was the oral law. Okay? So, at the time of Jesus, there wasn't a thing called the Mishnah. But there was a thing called the oral law. And the oral law in the 2nd century AD got written down, and it's called the Mishnah. The Talmud includes the Mishnah as well as a commentary on the Mishnah. So not only do we have the law, the first 5 books, we have the oral law, which tries to understand the first 5 books in context of life. And then we have the rest of the Talmud, which is commentary on the oral law, which is trying to interpret the real law. And when we get to Matthew, and Jesus says, "You have heard it said," that's not necessarily God's law. Some of that is just oral law. That's why I'm laying this out. Okay? It stems from God's law. But because the scholars have tried to interpret it over the years, sometimes when even today, we try to read the Bible and we try to make the Bible say what we think it says, sometimes we set up for ourselves some understandings and sometimes some regulations and restrictions that might not necessarily be what is intended by God. That's what the Jews did. And so they lost the main thrust of the law through their articulations about the law. I know I come from a religious heritage where it's very, well, generically speaking, it's very checklist oriented. And sometimes those checklists aren't what God intended in anyway. But because we've made the Bible say certain things in our own mind, we now believe or interpret through that understanding. That's what the Jews were doing in the 1st century. It's not necessarily that all of their hearts were wrong. That's just how they understood the way of the law, the way of life and the way of the law. Some of them were wrong. Some of them had bad motives and bad intentions. But a good many of them didn't have bad intentions. Paul absolutely thought he was doing the right thing, didn't he? He was fully devoted to what he was doing because he thought it was the right thing to do. Usually we don't do bad things because we want to do bad things. We do bad things because we think they're the right things, but they really end up being the bad things. Same thing for them. But a lot of that started in this experience where they were away from the temple. And now Ezra's coming in and they're setting up synagogues. Synagogues are a place where we discuss the law, where we build on the law, where we start talking about the law, and what law means to our life today, and how we are to react to that law. And all of a sudden we start setting up these rules and regulations about that law that aren't part of the law, but they're rules and regulations that become part of our life. So that's starting right about now, in the time of Ezra. I'm going to put Nehemiah / Ezra. Some people believe that Ezra wrote Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's an interesting thing. If you read 1st and 2nd Kings, those are the documents. Remember I said at one time, when a certain thing happened during a kingship, someone wrote it down. They kept a log, per se, or a journal of things that happened in the kingdom. That's what you read in 1st and 2nd Kings. Chronicles goes back and it goes through the exact same time, the exact same experience, but it views it from a perspective of religious thinking. Right with God, wrong with God. Not just what happened, but how did God feel about what, that's really not right. How did what happened fit within the context of goodness with God? So we read 1st and 2nd Kings, we read 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They actually talk about the same experiences, but from different perspectives. And some people think Ezra, remember Ezra is the revitalizing, the revisioning of religious experience. Some people think Ezra wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and he would be writing from that perspective. Let me rewrite your history from that religious perspective so that you better understand what happened to you and why it happened to you, that it may not happen again. Okay, we are going to end there for the day. It's already 11:30. So we are pretty much through the Persian experience. There's not a lot to say about the Persian experience except this revitalization of the kingdom. Next week, we will talk about the Grecian Empire. Remember that statue? We've got Babylon with a head of gold, or a head of, iron. No,
Gold.
with a gold, head of gold,
And silver.
then silver. We got the breast of silver. That's the Persian Empire. Next week, we'll talk about the Grecian Empire, which is the bronze part, and we will likely get into the Roman Empire. Probably get into the Roman Empire, which is the legs of iron. Okay? And then we'll be in Matthew. All right, let me pray right quick and we'll be dismissed. Lord, thank you so much for who you are and all you've done for us. You've given us the freedom to go back and look at your word, the freedom to think through it. And Father, we pray that as we look through it and we think through it, we don't recreate for ourselves rules and regulations that we should follow, but we open our hearts to understanding of who it is that you want us to be and how it is that you want us to be as we experience you, as we experience your love, and as we experience salvation through Jesus. Lord, help us to be your shining light, to spread your word and your will throughout the world around us. Thank you, Father, for the people here. Thank you for the love that we share. Thank you for these moments. We pray this through your Son's name. Amen.